Exodus chapter 25. If you don't have a Bible with you, I'd encourage you to grab the one in front of you in the pew back. You'll find it on page 61. And we're going to jump right into this. We're going to start our time by reading verses 1 and 2 and 8 and 9 from chapter 25. And you're going to find that in the course of our study tonight, we're going to read less than we typically do, simply because we're going to tackle 3 chapters tonight, chapters 25, 26, and 27. But what I would encourage you to do is, after you hear what is taught tonight, to then go and read it, okay? To go and actually read the text, because I'm going to make some conclusions and I'm going to give you some themes that you can look for, that when you read this, you might be able to read it with new eyes and with new interest. Because honestly, what we're about to read is an instruction manual. Okay, there aren't any actions that are taking place in our passage tonight. These are all instructions. So this is more like opening the box for the IKEA furniture and reading the directions, okay? I don't know if you've ever looked at IKEA furniture instructions, but it's all pictures of little men like pointing at different things, okay? That's what IKEA furniture instructions are. But these are instructions for how God's people should construct this thing called the tabernacle that we're going to talk about. So let's start by reading chapter 25, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel that they take for me a contribution. From every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive the contribution for me." Now skip down to verse 8. "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and of all its furniture. So you shall make it." Now, with all passages in the Bible that we would seek to study, we have to understand it in context, okay? What God is communicating is determined by everything else that surrounds it, okay? Context determines a lot. Let me give you an example. If I gave you the statement, "The carpet is brown," well, that may not have a lot of bearing unless you get context. The carpet is supposed to be white, okay? Now, that may not mean much unless I say something like, "The dog was in the mud." Okay, now we're starting to draw some connections. Now the carpet is brown, the dog was in mud. Maybe there's some connections there. I could provide more context. I could say, I was supposed to hose down the dog and dry him off before I let him in the house. Or the context could be, I don't have a dog. So context dictates a lot, right? It determines a lot about a situation. Well, tonight we're going to look at this passage, but we need to consider it in context. And when I say context for this passage, what surrounds it, I don't just mean the preceding chapter. I don't just mean chapter 24, but we want to look at chapters 25, 26, and 27 in the scope of the whole Bible, okay? So part of our task tonight will be going from Genesis to Revelation to help us understand why these 3 chapters are in our Bible and why we think they're important, okay? So when we go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible begins with God and God creating everything, right? And then he sets a part of his creation, separating it from the rest of creation. And that one part of creation that he sets apart are humans, or man. Man is created in God's image to have a relationship with God. So man is created in God's image, and he's also created in God's place, which we call the Garden of Eden. So there was this garden that God made, and he told man to live in it, to work it, to subdue it, to have dominion over it. So God has created man in his image and in his presence. And so as we've used the language so often in the past year, this is God's people living in God's place, under God's rule, and enjoying God's blessing. That's where the story starts. However, when we get to Genesis 3, we're met with this act of treason, this act of violating God's holy word, the rejection of his rule. Or, to put it more simply, we find sin. Man rejects God's rule. They attempt to undermine and usurp God's planned authority and order. And they make themselves the deciders of right and wrong. They put themselves in a place that is above God. Because they reject God's rule, they are no longer welcome in God's presence. And so they are excommunicated from God's place. So God curses them along with the rest of creation for their sin. and they are removed from God's presence. And the chapter 3 of Genesis ends like this. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. And so that may sound like an odd ending there, but what God is doing is he's setting up this guard so that man cannot come back into Eden in his sinful state. Man has sinned. God is holy, and so therefore they cannot have a fellowship, a right fellowship of relationship with one another. And so God prevents man from coming back in the garden out of mercy, because if man were to come back into God's presence, God would issue right punishment upon them. And so this becomes where man dwells, east of Eden. They are sent out east of Eden, no longer in God's presence. And the rest of the Bible asks this question: will it ever be again? Will it ever be that man can come back and be with God? Can we ever get back into God's presence? Can we go back to Eden? Well, our text tonight, these 3 chapters, set the wheels in motion to answer these very questions. I mean, look at verse 8. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. See, God tells them to make a sanctuary for him. Well, what is a sanctuary? Sometimes we think of a sanctuary like this room that we're in now. Many people refer to this as a sanctuary. But what is God talking about here? Well, I think he gives us a clue at the end of verse 8. The sanctuary is where God dwells. Now, God is not limited to a space. It's not as though they have put God in this box called the sanctuary, but rather, this is where God's presence dwells, meaning I am intending to be with my people. And so this is what God intends, to dwell with his people. And so we already see that things are starting to be reversed. Man is sent away from God's presence, but now God is saying, no, I want to come back and be with my people. So build a sanctuary that may take place. But verse 9 tells us that things are not quite the way they used to be. Verse 9, exactly as I show you, this is the building of the sanctuary, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle, which is a tent, and of its furniture, you shall make it. And so God's saying, I'm going to be with you, but here's how things are going to work. It's not going to be like Eden, at least not yet. And the place where God promises to dwell is not a garden, but a tent. And God has very specific instructions about how this tent will be built and the furniture that will fill it, how they should be made. But in all of this, no matter how tedious and detailed these passages might be, it's all an image to remind the people of God that he promises to restore his presence and his glory in them and through them. This is their way back. This is how they travel this is how they travel west. So let's look at a few things. Ethan, if you'll pull up the diagram of the temple real quick, or the tabernacle. So this is what we're going to walk through, okay? These 3 chapters to describe the building of all that we see here, okay? And we're going to mostly work left to right, inside out. And I know it's kind of hard to see. In the bottom right, there's a compass that tells us the direction that everything is set up, okay? And the way this is shaped, north is up and east is this way. So we're going to work from the west and we're going to move east. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a little bit. But let's talk about the first thing. So if you're reading from the Bible in the pew or you've got the journal Bible, you're going to have headings that are going to really help you tonight, okay? So starting in verse 10, we're going to talk about the Ark of the Covenant, as it's sometimes called, okay? Well, what is the Ark? Well, the Ark is a wooden chest that's covered in gold. All the furniture that comes into the tabernacle is covered in gold. It's very expensive, right? Very regal, very royal type furniture. Well, this ark, the word ark, simply means a chest or a box that is used to transport something. And in this case, this box houses the tablets of the covenant. So the tablets that God gives to Moses will go into this box, okay? And these 10 words that are written on these tablets are God's commands. And they're in the center of the tabernacle, which will sit in the center of the camp of the people. Remember, Israel isn't home yet. They don't have a home. They're in camps. They're in the wilderness. And so this tent comes in the middle of the camp, and then this ark will sit in the middle of the tent. Now, the Israelites would have recognized this. We're a little more divorced from this, and so it's harder for us to recognize this. But the picture here is something that a king would set his feet upon. Okay? Somewhere that a king would set his feet upon. So this is the image that Yahweh is the king of his people. Okay? And this is important for us to understand, that in the middle of the camp is this sign that God is king, which obviously implies that God's ruler, that God gets to tell his people how they should look, what they should do, and that's expressed in these commandments that we talked about a few weeks ago. So these are commands that should be followed. But as we talked about, these are the revealing of who God is. You want to know who the people of Israel are? Look to their God. Look at who their God is. Because this people is supposed to be under his authority, under his commands, under his rule, under his laws. And we're already seeing the reversal of what happened in Genesis, right? Adam and Eve, they reject God's rule. They don't submit to his laws. But now God is saying, no, I'm correcting that. You are going to be a people who are under my authority, who are under my rule. And so he's establishing this with his people once again. Now, God commands, you'll see in verse 17, you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. And the word here doesn't actually mean mercy seat. It's more of a lid. You might even have a footnote there, a little number that directs you down to a footnote that might say something like cover or lid. So this is just the top here, okay? When we talk about the mercy seat, it's everything up top, the lid as well as the angelic cherubim that are on top, okay? Now, what is this lid covering? Well, it's covering the law, right? So God's rule comes through his law. But every year, the high priest would come into the tabernacle and they would cover the top of this with blood, okay? As a sign that the penalty that the people owe to God. They owe God their lives because what have they done? They've rejected his rule. And so they come in and they place blood on top to show the penalty that we should owe has been paid for us. They'll offer bulls and goats on the altar outside and bring that blood in once a year and put it on top here. So we see that God is exhibiting his mercy. So that's why it's called the mercy seat. This was coined by a man named William Tyndale, okay, you probably won't remember that, but he called it the mercy seat, and that's just kind of stuck. Because this is a sign that God has mercy on his people. Instead of giving them what they deserve, he allows the top to be covered in blood. So God provides his rule as well as his mercy through the ark. Now, let's move now to the table. So across the room, there's this thing called the table of the presence. And this always had bread on it. Now, if you'll remember from last week, there were 70 elders who were invited onto the mountain, right? And what did they get to do? They got to see God's presence, and they got to eat a meal in view of God's glory, okay? This dramatic scene. But how does the scene end? They're forced to go back down the mountain. Well, God, in his kindness, sets up a table in the tabernacle, so when the people saw it, they were reminded, God desires fellowship with us. God does require holiness, but he desires his presence to be with us. He desires for us to enjoy fellowship with him. Now, this is sometimes lost on us because we don't have a culture that emphasizes the family table as much as it used to, right? Because of busy schedules, because of the access of fast food and things like that, we don't eat at home at the table as much as we used to. But that's a very familial, intimate experience. And this is meant to be reflected in the tabernacle, that God longs to be with his people, that he longs for his presence to be with them and for them to be his family. Next, we have a lamp that's placed, and it has 7 lamps coming out of it, okay? You may have seen something similar to this in a menorah, okay? That's basically what this is, but this is a tall lamp that's covered in gold as well. Not the type of lamp that you would want to knock over roughhousing with your brother, I'm sure. But this lamp, with these 7 lamps upon it, would burn continually. And it was in the tabernacle. Well, this was a sign to the people as well as those to the outside that God was with them, but also that God is light. 1 John 1:5 says this, "This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. See, this is the property of light, right? When light is ignited, darkness is obliterated, right? When God said, let there be light in the beginning, what's the assumption? Well, the darkness is gone. Well, this is true within the people as well. They're meant to be signs of God's glory to the nation. They are lights to the world, they're described. And so there were lights in the tabernacle to show this idea that God's glory was with his people and meant to be shown by his people. But look really quickly in verse 32. And there shall be, this is describing the construction of this lampstand, there shall be 6 branches going out of its sides, 3 branches of the lampstand out of one side, and 3 branches on the other side. 3 cups made like almond blossoms, each with calyx and flower on one branch, and 3 cups made like almond blossoms, each with calyx and flower on the other branch. I mean, what does this sound like? This doesn't sound like a lamp. This sounds like a tree. And so even in the construction of the tabernacle, God doesn't want his people to miss what's going on here. Because we as humans tend to be a little obtuse and dull when it comes to picking up on things. But God wants to make clear that he is replanting Eden in their midst. So it's a reconstruction of God's presence, of his place in the midst of the people of Israel. That God intends to restore what was lost out of the people. So this tree is planted and shows that God is restoring life that was once lost. Okay? Then, if you move to chapter 26, we get the construction of the tabernacle. And there's so much that could be said here, we genuinely don't have the time. So let's skip down to verse 31 of chapter 26. And you shall make a veil of blue and purple and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen. It shall be made with cherubim skillfully worked into it. Verse 33, and you shall hang the veil from clasps and bring the ark of the testimony in there within the veil. And the veil shall separate for you the holy place from the most holy. You shall put the mercy seat on the ark of the testimony in the most holy place. And you shall set the table outside the veil, and the lampstand on the south side of the tabernacle outside the table, and you shall put the table on the north side. So what you see here, they constructed the tabernacle at this point with these 4 different coverings, but then they're being instructed on how to make this curtain that will go right in the middle, okay? And you'll see on the left side, which again is the west side, the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, the ark is there, the 10 Commandments are in it, the mercy seat, the lid with the cherubim is on it, and then we have this curtain. And then you have over here, you have the table, and you have the golden lampstand. So both of them are in the tabernacle, both of them are described as holy places, but the part on the left, the west side, is the most holy, and the other part is just the holy place. So they're in the same place, but they're separated, okay? This large curtain. But did you pick up how this curtain is meant to be decorated? What is intended to be on this curtain? Well, a picture of cherubim, okay? So what is guarding God's people from having access to him? Well, God's messengers. God has established there will be a barrier between me and you. People will have access, or priests will have access to the holy place, the part on the right, but one time a year, the high priest, one person, one time a year, will be able to go through that curtain and offer blood on the altar, or on the ark, okay? Now, what is this intended to do? Well, it's less about keeping the people out. God saying, ooh, I don't want anything to do with you. You're going to make me sick. Stay away. No, that's not what God's saying. God is rather saying, it would be destruction for you to come into my presence. If this is where my presence truly resides, then you can't come in, okay? We bought this book recently for my son. It's called The Garden, the Curtain, and the Cross. And I read a review online that was talking about how this was a terrible book to read to children. And I was curious why, and I kept reading the review. And one of the reviews said, well, it talks so much about exclusion. Well, we're reading here exclusion. Because the book, all throughout it talks about Adam and Eve in the garden, and it says God sent them out and then placed an angel on the edge that said, you can't come in. Well, the same thing here in the tabernacle. God is saying by this large curtain with pictures of cherubim, these angelic beings on it, you can't come in because it would destroy. I would have to exhibit my wrath upon you. It would be for your destruction to come into my presence. Well, these divisions within the tabernacle are a sign that God is restoring things, but things aren't where they're supposed to be yet. God's people are closer to His presence than they've ever been, but they still can't get to where the Bible tells us we should long to be, in the presence of God. They can eat at the table. See, the table is on this side. They can eat at the table, but they can't go into His presence. They can see the light, but they can't see His face. So things are being restored. Things are better than they've ever been, but things are not where they need to be yet. And so the last thing we have to talk about is the altar on the eastern side here, right before you enter the courtyard. Now, the altar was essentially it was a stage. It's about 4.5 foot tall, and it was about 7.5 foot square, okay? So this is a very large piece, okay? Would have looked something like a stage. And on this, they would offer sacrifices of bulls and goats and lambs and birds and anything they had to pay penalty for, their sins. And this is on the outside. So let's go back to the map real quick. So this is on this easternmost edge. So when God's describing the construction of this temple, notice that He's moving from the inside out, okay? He starts with the ark, and then He works His way out. He gives the ark, and then the table, and then the lamp, and then the curtain that divides, and then we move further out, and we get to the altar, and then He'll also talk about the courtyard that surrounds it, okay? God is talking from the inside out. But then when this actually came into operation, when they started using it as it was supposed to, as we'll read at the end of Exodus, the way this worked is the opposite. God describes it from an inside out, from a west to east perspective, because they always set this up so that it was facing east. But when it was being used, they used it coming east to west. So this is a sign every time that it's being used that God is bringing His people back to where they should be in His presence. When an Israelite who came to the tabernacle to worship, you know what the first thing they would see? Blood and burning bodies. Okay? Burning carcasses of things that were offered on my behalf. So an Israelite looking at the altar is supposed to think, that should be me. But that is paying the price that I should have so that I can even walk into this space. God is restoring His people, and so everything works as a symbol. Everything works as a sign so that nobody misses it. This is a work of God to bring His people back to Himself. Now, you may be asking, after all of that, I've never seen anything like this. This is not something we practice today. I see no altars. I see no lamps like described other than decorations in some places. I don't see a table like they're talking about. I don't see curtains like this anymore. So what does that have to do with me? Why are we wasting our time talking about this construction project? Why are we reading this instruction manual? Well, the New Testament makes very clear that everything in this passage has to do with Jesus. So if you want to know Jesus, I suggest to you, we need to understand the importance of the tabernacle. And the reason I say this starts in John chapter 1, verse 14. It says this, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen His glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." And that word dwelt there literally means to tabernacle. Okay? So what John wants us to see is that Jesus is fulfilling what the tabernacle was supposed to do. God's presence coming to dwell with His people, being tabernacled, being sent in and amongst His people. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the tabernacle. But even more directly than that, we talked about there being a lampstand providing a light of the glory of God. John chapter 1, verse 9. "The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. And this is still talking about Jesus. John chapter 8, verse 12. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And what is this life? Well, it's God's glory. Paul in 1 Corinthians tells us that the glory of God is found in the face of Jesus Christ. So to know Jesus is to know the glory of God. What about the table? John chapter 6, verse 35. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. See, to partake of Jesus, to trust in Jesus, is to enjoy the presence of God. To partake in the presence of God. To be at His table, to commune with Him. Well, what about the altar? Well, as Taylor so helpfully put it in the song we sang earlier, we have a better sacrifice found in Jesus. Hebrews chapter 13. We have an altar. We don't see it here. Why? Well, because it's Jesus. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify, to make holy the people through His own blood. Jesus is the better sacrifice. And what about the law? The law and its requirements. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 13. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off, you who were once to the east, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. See, Jesus fulfills the law of God. He obeys God completely, and He also supplies the blood that covers the penalty that we deserve. And so through all of that, there's one piece that we still hadn't talked about. What about that curtain that still is the dividing wall? As Ephesians puts it, the wall of hostility between us and God. Matthew 27. This is as Jesus dies on the cross. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up His spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple, the curtain that was transferred from the tabernacle to the temple when the temple was built by Solomon and then restored later, this curtain, as Jesus dies, is torn in two. And notice the direction that it's tearing. It's tearing from top to bottom. This large, massive curtain that signaled God's presence, you are not welcome in God's presence, is now been torn. And it's torn by the path that Jesus supplies through it. So no longer is there a cherubim standing in front of God's presence preventing people in. But Jesus has torn down this wall of hostility so that we might be welcomed in by the cross. And then, Revelation chapter 1, 21. This is second to last chapter in the Bible. Ends this way. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of the heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for a husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, and I just imagine that this voice is responding to these voices that are echoing throughout eternity. Will God dwell with man again? And this voice responds in triumphant victory. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. And so because Jesus is the better tabernacle, we can come into God's presence. This is your greatest need, friends. To be in God's presence, because to be outside of God's presence is to experience death. But life is found in the presence of God for those who enter by the cross of Jesus. Jesus offering a sacrifice on your behalf so that your dwelling place would be with God, now and into eternity.